Season 11 didn't try to redeem anyone. It tried to rewrite reality. Season 11 stages an impressive feat of collective amnesia. A scandal detonates, mere months pass, and suddenly, the injured party is treated as the emotional extremist for declining casual conversation with the person who imploded her life. The cast behaves as if the appropriate timeline for betrayal is a few episodes, not a few months, and the result is a season-long exercise in blaming the wrong person for having boundaries. The central absurdity is simple. A partner destroys the relationship, detonates the home's sense of safety, and shatters the friend group. Yet the expectation is that the betrayed party should be the one to relocate, reset, and perform civility on command. The outrage over two people living under the same roof while not speaking is especially rich. The home was wrecked, but the problem is silence. That logic is not conflict resolution. It is convenience masquerading as morality. If anything, the only surprising detail is that basic self-protection measures, like a lock on the bedroom door or documentation to prevent any misunderstandings, weren't treated as standard practice in a house suddenly shared with someone untrustworthy. Of course, none of this happens in a vacuum. There are structural incentives dressed up as concern. The show's ecosystem has long depended on the cast cycling through the same pattern: dating, cheating, fighting, then returning to group hangouts like nothing happened. It is not that reconciliation is inherently noble. It is that it keeps scenes easy to film and checks easy to cash. Rumors of production pressure to make good reinforce what the season makes obvious. Unity is required, not because healing has occurred, but because fractured filming threatens the product. There is also an inconvenient business reality hovering over the storyline. Certain cast members are tied directly to brand extensions and business interests, which makes their continued relevance feel less optional. Yet the audience's attention has increasingly drifted toward the women's lives and away from extended side quests centered on the men. Scenes anchored in those businesses land as chores, less compelling television, more contractual obligation. While the season insists they are essential pillars of the narrative, what makes the group's indignation even more ridiculous is the show's own history. The franchise has repeatedly validated the idea that avoiding an ex is normal. Past seasons have featured explosive objections to exes being invited on trips, complete with shouting, theatrics, and group-wide outrage. Selective memory is doing heavy lifting here. Boundaries were acceptable when they served the loudest personalities. They became unreasonable when they interrupted the season's preferred arc. The cast's confusion is also partially self-inflicted. This is a friend group that tolerated years of questionable behavior, and that history makes a sudden insistence on moral clarity feel disruptive, not because it is wrong, but because it breaks the established contract of what gets excused. When someone stays for a decade despite witnessing patterns of deceit and disrespect, the surrounding circle may stop believing self-respect is part of the equation. Then, when self-respect finally arrives, everyone acts as though it is a plot twist rather than a long overdue correction. And then there is the performance of empathy, particularly from those who treat another person's trauma as an audition for relevance. The season features relentless comparisons, as if betrayal comes with a standardized grief schedule and a universal script for recovery. One cast member, in particular, repeatedly reframes the situation through personal experience, not to illuminate differences, but to invalidate them. The message is unmistakable. If the response does not match the speaker's preferred version of coping, it must be wrong. This would be merely annoying if it weren't paired with a glaring hypocrisy, expecting openness, discussion, and composure from someone else, while historically demanding strict silence and control when her own circumstances were under scrutiny. The jealousy leaks through the moralizing. Complaints about fairness, about opportunities, public sympathy, or momentum are recast as principled critiques. But the emotional math is obvious. Resentment is not analysis. It is resentment dressed in talking points. Another layer sits underneath the season's posture: projection. When cast members are dealing with their own betrayals and insecurities, it becomes convenient to police someone else's reaction instead of confronting their own. That kind of deflection is not subtle. It is a survival strategy, one that makes for messy television, but grim interpersonal ethics. Still, the season stumbles into a legitimate tension. Reality television is not real life, and cast members are, in fact, clocking in. Other personalities across the franchise have admitted that many reconciliations happened because filming required it, not because trust was rebuilt. Viewers typically expect a storyline with confrontation, fallout, and some form of resolution, something coherent enough to resemble a season rather than a set of disconnected fragments. From that perspective, refusing engagement can read like refusing the job. But that argument collapses the moment it pretends the job cancels humanity. The expectation that someone should immediately film closure scenes with a person who just detonated their stability is not professionalism, it is emotional extraction. And the insistence that the betrayed party should either perform interaction or disappear entirely reduces the situation to a production problem, not a personal crisis. If stepping back was the healthier choice, that would have been a legitimate route. Yet, it is telling how quickly the ensemble frames self-preservation as selfishness. Season 11 ultimately reveals the show's real conflict, not the affair itself, but the cast's panic when one person refuses to maintain the group's long-running illusion that betrayal is just another storyline bump. The outrage is not about healing, it is about disruption. The scandal forced a choice between authenticity and the machine, shocking no one, demanded to be fed. They didn't forget Peter. They priced him out and called it a creative decision. The season's grand promise of returning to people who actually work at the restaurant arrives with an almost performance art-level omission. Peter, the one original face who still plausibly qualifies as employed. If credibility were the goal, a few brisk scenes of him doing the unglamorous job of managing the new cast would be the easiest form of continuity. Simple, functional, and mildly reassuring. Naturally, that would require treating a working employee like an employee, which appears to be the one concept the production cannot commit to. The more plausible explanation is the same tired calculus that surfaced in Season 11. The expectation of unpaid appearances dressed up as exposure, followed by the inconvenient moment when someone declines to work for free. After that little experiment in cost-cutting, enthusiasm for re-entering the frame, whether for pocket change or another speech about gratitude, would understandably be limited. Of course, the absence has been spun into the usual folklore, complete with jokes about being quietly handled by HR in a back alley, because nothing says fine dining like a mythologized service corridor. And yes, it is hard to ignore the irony of a network willing to bankroll chaos while nickel-and-diming a long-tenured staffer. Apparently, professionalism is a luxury item. Still, the fantasy of Peter as the essential bridge between eras deserves a reality check. As a character, he has never been mistaken for electricity. The appeal here is not entertainment value so much as structural usefulness, an anchor, a link, a familiar badge of authenticity. Without him, the new cast floats unmoored. With him, at least, there is a managerial spine holding the spectacle upright. That said, any attempt to position him as one of the gang rather than the manager would land exactly where it always does. Uncomfortable. Watching an older supervisor orbiting much younger staff as anything other than their boss reads less like charming nostalgia and more like an HR seminar in progress. If Peter returns, the only role that makes sense is the one he was hired for, running the room, not auditioning for youth. Meanwhile, the side confusion about Paolo can be filed under unnecessary noise. Paolo is not Peter, but a separate figure connected socially to Natalie and Guillermo, reportedly sidelined by an accident. As for whether Peter shows up at all, the season is currently treating his presence like a rumor and his absence like policy, either because he opted out or because the production's budget priorities continue to favor everything except paying a working manager to appear on a show about the place where he works. Here's the part of Scandival people keep glossing over. The affair wasn't the worst thing. The friendship performance was. Reaching the Scandoval episode has a reliably physical effect. Nausea, anger, and the creeping realization that the show has been calmly building a betrayal with the kind of casual cruelty usually reserved for cautionary tales. Knowing it is coming does not soften the impact, it sharpens it. Watching the pre-scandal closeness between Ariana and Raquel turns the affair from mere mess into something pointedly malicious. Nothing elevates treachery like the performance of friendship, warm smiles, intimate conversations, and the serene confidence of someone who knows the knife is already in hand. Ariana is not portrayed as flawless or even consistently likable, largely because she has spent an impressive amount of time giving Tom Sandoval the benefit of the doubt, while he behaves as though accountability is a decorative concept. Still, whatever reservations exist about her judgment do not translate into a lack of empathy when the ground collapses beneath her. Raquel's behavior before the reveal is not subtle foreshadowing. It is baiting with a polite grin. The party interactions are particularly grim, including the spectacle of dismissiveness toward Katie's mother, an attitude that manages to be both childish and calculated, as though basic respect were an optional add-on. Even worse is the pointed probing about Ariana's sex life with Tom, delivered with the wide-eyed innocence of someone just asking questions, a tactic that lands less as curiosity and more as interrogation disguised as friendship. If it feels like demon work, that is because it is. Specifically, the variety later mocked as a very stupid demon, a line worth noting for being a borrowed quote rather than an original stroke of wit. The rewatch factor makes everything uglier. Moments that once read as awkward now read as rehearsed. The absence of visible remorse, no guilt, no flinch, no hesitation, does not create ambiguity. It creates a chill. One of the most stomach-turning clips is the giggling exchange after the "wouldn't trust you around my man" warning, complete with eye contact that feels less like chemistry and more like shared contempt. Placed near the timeline of Guys' Night, it plays like an inside joke with Ariana as the punchline. And then there is the episode-adjacent hypocrisy, Raquel shedding tears over Ariana, not feeling her best self, as if compassion were a costume that could be worn while actively manufacturing the reasons someone is falling apart. The logical conclusion is difficult to avoid. If trust survives that, it does so out of necessity, not optimism. Sandoval's defense tour is its own masterclass in performative self-pity. The apology that immediately complains about Ariana's reaction, because nothing says contrition like irritation at the consequences, functions less as remorse and more as an attempt to reframe betrayal as a misunderstanding. It is not persuasive. It is infuriating. Ariana's verbal precision in response lands because it is unsentimental and immediate, including the iconic deadpan of wanting the only thing he can do for her to be to die, followed by the quieter, colder reduction, "You are nothing." It is the rare reality television moment that feels like a final verdict rather than a dramatic flourish. For some viewers, this scandal didn't merely entertain. It provided a strangely effective distraction during real-life hardship, including extended hospital stays late in pregnancy due to preeclampsia, an experience that is medically serious and personally brutal, and made no less so by the fact that televised chaos happened to fill the hours. The outcome, thankfully, is the only part of this entire saga that should be uncomplicated. The child is healthy and thriving. Naturally, the aftermath invites obsessive scrutiny. Season 10. Episodes 14 and 15 get replayed like evidence, and Season 9 becomes the next excavation site for earlier signs. That is the uncomfortable genius of the scandal. It retroactively infects ordinary scenes, turning casual conversations into clues and friendly gestures into potential alibis. It was a cultural watershed for many precisely because it managed to be both outrageous and oddly believable. An affair hidden in plain sight by people who behaved as though morality were someone else's job. And when the dust settles, the simplest truth remains the most damning. Nothing in this spectacle was worth that kind of hurt, no matter how loudly anyone insists they tried to apologize. The real villains of Vanderpump Rules aren't the main cast. It's the background climbers who treat relevance like a civil right. The secondary cast of Vanderpump Rules has always served a noble purpose, reminding viewers that fame is not a meritocracy and screen time is not a reward for competence. Some friends of drift in, do a little damage, and drift out. Others arrive with the frantic energy of someone auditioning for oxygen. The results vary, occasionally entertaining, often unbearable, and sometimes so forced it feels like performance art with no funding. The forced, the fraudulent, and the painfully performative veil, Season 2, remains a masterclass in manufactured presence. Polished resume, prestigious education, and absolutely no believable reason to be entertaining Jax Taylor as if he were a serious conversational partner. Watching her attempt to play intellectual chemistry with him was less a storyline than a prolonged exercise in secondhand embarrassment. It wasn't quirky. It wasn't endearing. It was the televised equivalent of someone insisting they are above all this while actively participating in it. Jo, Season 11, by contrast, isn't forced in the same way. She's simply unsettling. There is a difference between awkward authenticity and chaotic desperation, and Jo barrels straight into the latter with the conviction of someone who believes relevance is a human right. The vibe is not misunderstood, but one unhinged monologue away from everyone slowly backing out of the room. If Vale was trying too hard to seem interesting, Jo was trying too hard to stay present. Laura Lee, while undeniably cringeworthy, at least had the decency to be sincere about it. The oddness read as real, not rehearsed. That alone puts her above the others. Genuine weirdness is still weird, but it doesn't feel like a strategy meeting. Then there's the Peter-Jax love triangle era, which deserves recognition as one of the more physically uncomfortable viewing experiences the show has produced. It was butt-clenching television, not dramatic, not compelling, just deeply awkward in a way that made the audience feel complicit. Billie Lee's missed chess move. Billie Lee had what reality television loves most, a built-in storyline and an immediate reason to be featured. The problem was treating that initial momentum like a permanent contract. Identity may open the door, but it rarely sustains the room, especially on a show where longevity is less about personal truth and more about social warfare with lighting. From a purely strategic standpoint, the fumble was obvious. Reality TV is not a place for hopeful idealism. It is a place for alliances, timing, and knowing exactly which conflict will feed you through the season. Billie had an opportunity to become a fixture, but became fixated instead. Unable to let go of the girls' night grievance, and ultimately detonating her own positioning through repeated clashes. The conflict with Lala didn't help, but the real kiss of death was disrespecting Lisa Vanderpump. That is not bravery. It is career self-harm. History has been clear. Crossing Lisa is how side characters become footnotes. Ask Jax and Kristen. The smarter play would have been aligning with Stassi and Kristen when they raised concerns about Jeremy. That would have created tension with Ariana, and, because Stassi and Ariana were already positioned against each other that season, it would have given Stassi an incentive to keep Billie close, dragging her into the broader narrative web that keeps people employed. Instead, Billie largely vanished until the Scandoval era, when aligning with Tom and isolating from Ariana conveniently restored screen time. Suddenly, the strategy appeared, just much later than the opportunity. There was also a particularly grim moment of transactional grievance politics, an exchange that boiled down to the threat of playing a trans card in response to a fat-shaming card. Whatever the intent, it landed like a cynical negotiation, not a principled stand, and did nothing to make Billie look like a stable, long-term addition. The fringe men who linger. Peter is the show's patron saint of lingering, always nearby, always available, always somehow not quite included. The fringe guy who radiates the unmistakable aura of being left out of a group chat. His presence often comes with the odd pacing of dead air, as if the edit itself is unsure why he's speaking. And then the inevitable reality. A manager who dates staff is not a romantic lead, but a liability. The fact that he dated employees while managing them is not charming maturity. It is workplace creepiness with a Sir backdrop. The "where's my hug" energy, the slightly too familiar physicality, the carefully practiced reactions, none of it reads as harmless. It reads as familiar in the worst way, because everyone has encountered that person. Season 8 also introduced an entire lineup of forgettable additions, so forgettable that even their love triangles struggled to earn basic viewer interest. The storylines weren't just dull, they were aggressively irrelevant. The supporting cast of Crimes Against Taste, Kyle Chan earns a special category: unhealthy attachment to and relentless defense of the men. A loyal soldier to the least deserving cause. And what happens to perfectly fine jewelry under his influence should be treated as a minor international incident. Brett, the one associated with Tom Tom and enthusiastic Sandoval worship, now operating under the name Jack Dazzo, delivered a particularly infamous brand of cringe, a song aimed at mocking Katie and her mother, followed by the predictable self-pity tour. Nothing says artistic credibility like weaponizing secondhand humiliation and then complaining about the consequences. James' father, calling himself a London gangster, is the kind of delusion that deserves its own confessional segment and a mandatory silence afterward. Some people are embarrassing, others are committed to the role. Logan also deserves mention, particularly for the messy ethical double-bind. There is an argument that someone involved with James had the right to discuss their own experiences, especially given James' pattern of flirtation and leading people on. But revealing someone's sexuality without consent remains a violation, regardless of the interpersonal chaos surrounding it. The mothers, the mean girls, and the human accessories. Among the peripheral figures, certain relatives make unforgettable impressions for all the wrong reasons. Shiana's mother registers as oddly cringeworthy, an inexplicable stage mom from the Bushes presence that feels like it wandered in from a different genre. Stassi's mother belongs in her own category entirely, a bottomless well of discomfort that could derail an entire season if given enough airtime. Terry Maloney, however, is not the problem. She remains the rare, non-toxic presence who can stay without argument. Christina Kelly is divisive in a way that almost proves the point. She doesn't need a storyline because she functions as an accessory, someone production uses when a main cast member needs a filming partner and the rest of the ensemble refuses to participate. Her mean girl energy is consistent, but without the charm or wit required to make it entertaining. The practiced delivery of her barbs suggests a mirror rehearsal schedule, and her behavior around Shiana's wedding situation, ready to leave Katie behind if it meant proximity to the event, exposed the role clearly: not loyal friend, but efficient drama courier. The final verdict: cringe isn't always equal. Some figures are cringeworthy because they are authentically strange. Others are cringeworthy because they are strategically desperate, painfully rehearsed, or socially predatory. Vale performed sophistication while chasing relevance. Joe performed relevance while unraveling on camera. Billy Lee arrived with momentum and treated it like immunity, then learned the hard way that this franchise rewards chess players, not hopeful ideologues. Peter lingered like a cautionary tale in tight shirts and managerial authority. And if one name insists on rising to the top of this roster of secondhand shame, it is Billy Lee. Not because the story was unimportant, but because the execution was so catastrophically self-sabotaging that it turned opportunity into exile, until the next scandal offered a convenient way back in. Everyone saying the original was low budget too is missing the entire point, and it's exactly why this reboot already feels dead on arrival. If the series had any remaining dignity to sacrifice, it managed to misplace it here. The so-called new era arrives wearing the unmistakable costume of cost-cutting, a cast that feels oddly interchangeable, a setting that reads less iconic chaos laboratory and more tired workplace tour, and an overall sheen that suggests the production budget was redirected to absolutely anything else. The original appeal was never subtle. The premise was hot young Los Angeles waitstaff colliding romantically and behaving atrociously with the confidence of people who mistake entitlement for charisma. The twist, of course, was that the cast was rarely model perfect. The entertainment came from the audacity, the mess, the vanity, and the delusion, not from a lineup of flawless specimens. This time, however, even that baseline spark is strangely absent, leaving the reboot asking viewers to invest in yet another group of young people without delivering the reckless electricity that once made the concept work. Naturally, the predictable counterargument appears. It was only one episode, and the early seasons looked low rent too. Fair enough, those first episodes were hardly glossy, and the scrappiness contributed to the charm. The show didn't truly detonate until the second season, when betrayal became sport and the central triangle of deceit turned into a franchise engine. But revisionist history can be retired. The original launch had an immediate jolt. The camera swooped in from a built-in cultural ecosystem, a crossover that arrived already humming with conflict, tabloid intrigue, and enough social friction to catch fire on contact. There was energy in the opening minutes, not merely the promise of energy later. That early momentum wasn't an accident. It was a structured introduction with real narrative fuel, not a slow request for patience. By contrast, the new iteration feels shabby in a way that is not nostalgic, but deflating. The venue no longer registers as the happening place where disasters are born. It plays like a set trying to impersonate its former self. Even more awkwardly, the cast reads older than the original ensemble did at the start, which reframes the inevitable sexcapades from gleeful train wreck to something closer to exhausted obligation. Instead of scandalous and shameless, the whole enterprise risks sounding like a collective midlife negotiation with consequences everyone can already predict. Still, the experiment isn't entirely lifeless. A few personalities show early signs of being gloriously unhinged, and that alone may keep the cameras rolling. The low-budget label, however, deserves precision. Cheap lighting and scrappy production are not the real issue. The early seasons prove that. The problem is the faintly theatrical quality of casting near strangers who appear to be performing the job title rather than living the workplace ecosystem that once made the chaos feel uncomfortably authentic. That is the difference between charmingly rough around the edges and fundamentally manufactured. Which is why dismissing criticism with the original was also doesn't land as the rebuttal it wants to be. The original didn't simply start small, it started plugged into a larger narrative machine and arrived with immediate, bizarre, specific character moments, exactly the kind that cannot be focus grouped into existence. And then there is the surrounding commentary cycle, which has become its own dreary subplot. Endless repetition of the same complaints, as if saying, cancel it in bulk, constitutes analysis. Dislike is not an obligation, and participation is optional. Anyone determined to hate-watch the premiere like a civic duty can just as easily turn the channel. At the same time, enthusiasm is not a moral failure. Viewers willing to give a new cast room to grow are not delusional for wanting the show to succeed. They are simply applying the patience that long-running franchises routinely demand. What does sabotage discussion is the habit of dropping a thin, two-sentence verdict and then treating disagreement as a personal attack, because nothing says serious conversation like picking fights with anyone who refuses to join the pile-on. If the reboot has a problem, it is not that debate exists. It is that the loudest voices keep confusing hostility for insight and performance for critique, an oddly fitting reflection of the very show under review. Everyone keeps begging for the infamous audio, but the real scandal isn't what was said, it's how it was captured. The obsession with releasing the infamous Faith Phone audio continues to age like fine dairy left in the sun, predictably, intensely, and with a devoted audience insisting it would be worth it anyway. A transcript may have been summarized before, but summaries are never enough when the public believes it deserves the full, unfiltered experience, right down to the allegedly transcribed cocaine snorts, treated with the reverence usually reserved for historic speeches. The transcript is repeatedly praised as a nauseating masterpiece, captivating, gag-inducing, and somehow rereadable, which says less about its literary value than it does about the appetite for televised dysfunction. Credit, naturally, is heaped on whoever took the time to transcribe it, as though documenting the sound effects of bad decisions is a public service. The emotional arc is consistent: eager anticipation, immediate disgust, and then a return trip for seconds. Then comes the inconvenient detail that tends to ruin everyone's fantasy of an official release. The recording itself is widely understood to have been obtained illegally. California is a two-party consent state, meaning audio recording generally requires everyone involved to know it's happening, especially when there is a reasonable expectation of privacy, such as an intimate setting with, unbelievably, an unconscious person nearby. Exceptions exist, including certain situations involving evidence of a crime, but this recording does not fit neatly into those carve-outs. The practical takeaway is less cinematic than the outrage suggests. Illegal recordings typically can't be used in court, and everyday enforcement is rare. Consequences become more realistic when the person recorded is high profile and the publication demonstrably damages reputation, at which point legality stops being theoretical and starts becoming expensive. As for the contents, the core scoop that circulates is blunt and thoroughly on brand. Jax reportedly expressed that he did not want to marry Brittany, did not want children with her, and was not attracted to her. Cruel sentiments delivered with all the tenderness expected from a man famous for emotional demolition. That is the portion most commonly summarized, yet the hunger persists for every last word, as if additional minutes of disrespect might somehow provide deeper cultural insight. Meanwhile, Brittany has reportedly voiced regret about playing the audio publicly at that infamous party, which is an understandable reaction for anyone who remembers humiliation is not, in fact, a love language. The more staggering detail remains unchanged. Despite everything, the marriage still happened. And if that decision-making process needs a clinical label, absolutely, completely psychotic is the assessment that keeps resurfacing, countered only by the occasional voice of reason insisting the audio should not be released at all, if only to prevent the world from pretending this spectacle deserves an encore. Everyone's blaming Natalie for being unbearable, but the real problem is the show begging to be something it's not. Natalie has arrived with all the subtlety of a fire alarm and roughly the same emotional range. From the first moments, the performance is so aggressively aware of itself that it becomes its own subplot. Is this an intentional act of camp, or simply an unedited personality? Either way, the result is the same: an exhausting, attention-forward presence that seems engineered to be quotable, memorable, and endlessly discussed. Unfortunately, effort is not a substitute for charisma. The most telling example is the phone notes routine, a transparent attempt to manufacture iconic one-liners that lands with the charm of a pre-written acceptance speech. The delivery does not help. The vocal inflection, already a recurring irritation across the cast, turns every line into something that sounds practiced, polished, and strangely hollow. The tragic part is that the potential is there. Natalie could easily become the kind of captivating train wreck that reality television thrives on. Instead, the relentless self-producing makes the mess feel calculated, and calculation is rarely entertaining. Meanwhile, the show itself seems determined to cosplay a legacy it has not earned. Rather than letting a new cast build its own identity, the atmosphere leans hard into familiar archetypes and recycled beats, as if imitation automatically generates chemistry. It does not. The cast appears shameless enough to attempt good television, but also far too hyper-aware of the cameras to surrender to authentic chaos. The result is a tone that reads less like reality and more like a parody, a glossy mockumentary in which everyone is trying to appear likable, dramatic, and iconic all at once. Naturally, this produces none of the above. A few personalities still manage to cut through the self-conscious noise. Venus stands out as the most tolerable presence, authentic enough to feel human, sharp enough to deliver genuine humor, and grounded enough to make the others look even more performative by comparison. The appeal is not mystery, it is simply relief. In a cast competing for maximum obnoxiousness, being the least unbearable becomes a superpower. Demi shares that advantage. Compared to the rest, she reads as level-headed and relatively natural, an unsettling contrast that only highlights how hard others are trying. She is not forcing a brand. She is simply existing, which currently qualifies as rare talent. Then there is the male casting, an achievement in mediocrity, so consistent it almost feels curated. The general impression is delusion powered by unearned confidence, the familiar spectacle of mediocre male audacity presented as personality. Marcus appears positioned as a central agitator, telegraphing a role rather than revealing a person. The effect is irritating, and the comparison to legacy troublemakers is inevitable, though not flattering. Whatever charm might be required to sell the archetype does not appear to be present. The blonde counterpart fares no better, especially when leaning into behavior designed to provoke someone he claims to like, as if antagonism is a love language. It is not. It is just embarrassing. Audrey sits in a separate category, corny, chaotic, and potentially useful. There is an unpredictable energy that could tip into entertaining mess, provided it stays organic and does not become another rehearsed brand pitch. So far, the tolerance remains intact. Kim is harder to place, part hot mess, part looming annoyance, with the strong possibility of becoming a recurring headache. The relationship dynamics also feel suspiciously prepackaged, like a couple auditioning for screen time rather than revealing real stakes. Early-stage relationships erupting into high-intensity drama can be compelling when there is history underneath. Here, the short timeline makes the intensity feel less tragic and more transactional, an attempt to manufacture significance before any exists. The show's broader problem is that it keeps reaching for the mythology of earlier seasons without understanding why those seasons worked. The original chaos was compelling because the cast's plans to control perception collapsed immediately under the weight of real relationships and real dysfunction. The current group seems determined to control every angle, until the mask slips. And it will. The most promising thread is the possibility that Natalie's carefully assembled persona eventually gives way to something genuinely unhinged, the kind of uncontrolled reality that cannot be planned, managed, or typed into a phone notes app. The glimpses are there. The day-off meltdown energy suggests the performance may not hold forever. Overseeing all of this is a noticeably weary authority figure who seems less amused than obligated. The concern about business feels sharper, more anxious, and more present than expected. Less playful scolding, more real-world pressure. With restaurants and bars increasingly unstable in the current climate, the tolerance for employee nonsense appears lower, and the sense of endless second chances feels like a relic. This is not the era for indulgent disasters. Ironically, the show is trying to recreate one, and hovering behind the scenes is the missing presence of expected familiar faces, an absence that makes the attempted legacy branding feel even more strained. If the goal is continuity, the execution is oddly committed to disconnection, which brings everything back to Natalie, the would-be breakout, the would-be quotable villain, the would-be successor to a very specific reality TV lineage. The ambition is obvious. The problem is that the performance reads as value brand imitation, assembled from the worst traits of past archetypes, delivered with maximum effort and minimum ease. Trying to be the new star is not the same as being one. Right now, the only thing landing consistently is the exhaustion,